Good morning. It is Sunday, May the 1st. Thank God it's Sunday. And this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So after the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have no free lunch, the collapse of parenting, the last few chapters of Chapter 6, or a few paragraphs of Chapter 6, and Memorial Day Trouble from the book, The Tales of My Bicentennial Year by Michael Buell. All that and more when I get back. Thank you. And now the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for May the 1st. I have defeated the prince of this world. My child, by the death and resurrection of my son Jesus, he has made you alive together with him, and he has nailed your sins to his cross. He has disarmed all principalities and powers and made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them. Therefore, do not forget that you no longer walk according to the course of this world or according to the demands of the prince of the power of the air. But through the grace of my Son, you have been saved through faith, and he has defeated all the powers of the prince of this world from having any effect on your life. Therefore, rise up in faith and power, and when the prince of this world attempts to harass you, say, "Sit down, for your rule will collapse, and you will be carried away captive because of the power of my great God in me." Colossians chapter 2, verse 15, Ephesians chapter 2, verse 2, Jeremiah chapter 13, verse 18. Prayer declaration. Jesus, you have cast out the prince of this world and defeated him. You spoiled principalities and made an open show of them. Because of your great power within me, I bind the power of the air in your name. I bind the principalities and powers in my region in the name of Jesus, and I command the principalities to come down. The power of God at work in me has made the demands of the prince of this world of no effect in my life. Amen. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for May the 1st. Thank you very much. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. Quote, the message from history is so blatantly obvious that free trade causes mutual prosperity while protectionism causes poverty, that it seems incredible that anybody ever thinks otherwise. There's not a single example of a country opening its borders to trade and ending up poorer," unquote. Matt Ridley. Modern political and even cultural debate around free trade does not center around its impact to the country opening its borders to it. Even free trade opponents know it will make the country richer. The controversy comes around the mutual prosperity that Ridley speaks of, which is to say, the former maker of a good inside country A that country A will now buy from country B. Disenfranchising a company in country A to serve the consumers of country A and benefit the company in country B is alleged to be unfair or immoral for the company in country A. But of course, such protectionism, the notion that the consumers of this country should be hurt with higher prices in order to help a company that would otherwise lose the business, is simply moving the victim in your own country from one person to another. Yes, one is more identifiable than the other, but there is no free lunch here," unquote. The nature of trade agreements between countries warrants ample discussion, and such discussion will be better served once participants understand that countries do not trade with each other, companies trade with each other, presumably under the guidance of what best serves that company's needs. There are legitimate discussions around matters of national security, intellectual property, and supply chain sufficiency for health and welfare. But what cannot be denied in the most basic of senses, if we are to have an intellectually honest discussion about free trade, is that free trade causes mutual prosperity and protectionism causes poverty. To deny that is to deny the most basic reality of market function. And that's, there's no free lunch. Thank you. And now the collapse of parenting is going to be at the end of chapter 6. So I'm kind of doing this a little bit out of order, but there's a few paragraphs at the end of chapter 6 that I really wanted to read and comment on because the author gets this wrong. It sounds like he gets it right, but he really doesn't, and I'll explain in a minute. A regular contributor to the New York Times, Jennifer Finney Boylan, recently published a column in which she asked the question, what is school for? What does getting an education actually mean? What should it mean? Boylan offers two contrasting ideals, one old and one new. The old ideal, as she describes it, is about handing down shared values of the community to the next generation. This ideal she disparages. In its place, she promotes a new ideal, which she describes as enlightening our children's minds with the uncensored scientific and artistic truth of the world. If that means making our own sons and daughters strangers to us, then so be it. That may sound brave and noble to some. It is certainly vintage 21st century American, but the moment you begin to unpack it, questions arise. What precisely is the artistic truth of the world? Is the music of Mozart and Beethoven and Brahms and Stravinsky and Copland closer to the artistic truth of the world than the music of Katy Perry and Nicki Minaj and Lil Wayne and Justin Bieber and Miley Cyrus? Are the ethics of Lehman Brothers circa 2007 better or worse than the ethics of Mother Teresa circa 1977? Who gets to decide? If one simply sets kids loose in the chaos of 21st century culture in the hopes that they will discover the artistic truth of the world, what those kids will discover is most likely the popular culture of the internet, social media, online video games, and pornography. They have no standard by which to judge Miley Cyrus or Nicki Minaj in comparison with Stravinsky or Copland. No standard by which to compare the accounting gimmicks at Lehman Brothers with the altruism of Mother Teresa, because no authoritative teacher will have instructed them in a scale of value. Self-control is not innate. Honesty is not innate. These virtues have to be taught. If you don't teach them, who will? You can't rely on schools to do this job. Not in the United States. Not in this era. In fact, the abdication of authority that Boylan and others put forward as enlightened wisdom is not wisdom at all. It is a dereliction of duty. It is a retreat from adult responsibility. As social critic Roger Scruton recently observed, the end result is that an American education, conceived in this way, is nothing more than a rite of passage into cultural nothingness, with no clear guidance about what is worthwhile and what is not. I'm not singling out Boylan personally. On the contrary, I've heard the sentiments she expresses presented at leading universities across the United States during school board meetings in the United States and from the heads of leading public and private schools across the United States. Across the United States, but not elsewhere. This peculiar notion that the best schools are those most completely sever the bonds between parent and child, that most completely undermine parents' values and traditions, is uniquely American. Reject the notion of virtue promoted by Boylan and company. Think carefully about the virtues you want your children to possess and teach them diligently. Inscribe them on your children. That means, among other things, that you must yourself demonstrate the virtues you want your child to develop. Teach your child self-control and restraint, which is no easy task in a culture where billboards scream, "Live for now." The stakes are the highest imaginable. The health and happiness of your child. This matters. And that was the end of the last few paragraphs of chapter 6. And so anyways, where he makes the mistake and where he goes wrong, he starts correctly. He quotes this woman as asking some particular questions. And at first, what is school for? What does getting an education actually mean? What should it mean? And the answer to those questions from any true conservative should be, who cares? Who cares? Let her, because again, what we got going on here is this woman, Miss Boylan, Finney Boylan, is pushing for change. She wants things to be different, ostensibly better, but she wants change. So this is a political issue. Again, politics fundamentally is about one issue, and that's change. One issue and all the details surrounding change. Who, what, where, when, and why. But the problem is we don't get any of the answers to any of those questions. All we're getting basically is the whats. Handing down shared values, which is supposedly no good. And instead, she thinks that we should have uncensored scientific and artistic truth of the world as the Enlightenment objective as far as education is concerned. But again, first question should be, why? Who cares? What difference does it make? These are questions that any true conservative should be asking immediately. And until Miss Boylan answers those questions, the answer is no. I'm sorry, everything's fine the way it is. So until Ms. Boylan can explain in detail why things are the way they are is no good, and how it is that her way is going to be the best way to correct the problem, we're going to stick with what we have. That's called making the presumption for the status quo. We're not married to the status quo. We as true conservatives will change when there is an obvious case for change. Miss Boylan simply making an arbitrary claim is not an obvious case for change. So these are all of the things that Mr. Cox should have gotten into. Instead of what he does is he gets baited into trying to prove a negative. Try to prove why her idea is not a good idea. And it's difficult to do because, first of all, we don't have any answers to the question. She doesn't give us any details. And without the details, we cannot support nor can we reject her arbitrary claim. What should happen is it should be ignored. To do anything else is to help Miss Boylan create this change. The more we fight it, the more we resist it, the bigger of a deal it becomes, and it ends up becoming a movement, and very possibly and very probably a movement with some force, with some potency to it, and a movement that may end up bearing fruit. and it shouldn't, until, again, we've gotten the details, until the questions have been answered, and until this lady can prove that this change is necessary. Her idea should simply be ignored. And that's again, the last few chapters, or last few paragraphs of chapter 6 of the book, The Collapse of Parenting, How We Hurt Our Children When We Treat Them Like Adults. Thank you. And now My Bicentennial Year, or Tales from My Bicentennial Year by Michael Buell, about a family in Gansevoort, New York, in the Adirondacks in 1975. Actually, it's from 1975 to 1976, hence Bicentennial. And I'm reading this book because it's an excellent slice of Americana. This is in the 70s is when I came of age. But it's an excellent slice of Americana to see how our culture used to be before conservatives in this country went ahead and allowed the left to screw it up, for lack of a better term. So, but anyways, the last chapter was about, chapter 24 was about Yankee Stadium, where the several families, the three dads and several of the children got together, and they all went to Yankee Stadium to watch the Yankees play the Red Sox. And so they saw the Yankees defeat the Red Sox 1-0. And Michael had a bit of a problem with using the restrooms, and so quite the adventure there. And so now we're moving on to chapter 25, The Great Memorial Day Trouble. We had such a great time at the Yankee game that we kept playing baseball every day. By Memorial Day, even baseball was getting a little bit old. We started playing a game we called Planet of the Apes. It was pretty simple, and now that the mayor, Bill Campbell's cornfield was getting pretty high, we had a great place to play. 2 guys would get to be the apes, and the rest of us would be the humans. If you were an ape, you got to take your bike into the cornfield. If you were a human, you had to walk. We did a series of rock, paper, scissors to see who got to be the apes. Turns out, Big Russ and Mike C. came up the winners. Mike C., because he still had the cast on his arm, wasn't sure he wanted to be an ape. But after hearing everyone trying to get his spot, he figured an ape was the best thing to be. We all loved the whole Planet of the Apes craze. Heck, they even had a Saturday morning cartoon now. There's nothing better than wolfing down your generic Cheerios on a Saturday morning while watching Cornelius try and break free from the gorillas and help the human astronauts. To play the game, the apes would ride their bikes into the cornfield. This is easier said than done. The corn rows were about a foot or so up wide apart, and as long as you were going down a row, you were in great shape. But when you had to cross over a row, you got ripped to shreds. The leaves on the corn stalks were sharp. They would dig into your skin on your arms as you cut over the rows. The humans would go in after a few minutes. The goal was to get lost in the cornfield so no one can find you. The apes were the ones looking for you. The humans would go in after a few minutes. The goal was to get lost in the cornfield so no one could find you. The apes were the ones who were looking for you. We treated our humans just the same way that the apes did in the movie. Remember when Charlton Heston and the guys first ran into the humans, they went swimming, and the humans stole their clothes. They chased after them and caught up with them next to an ape cornfield. There they stood thinking they would be kings of this world until some sort of Viking horn blew. Then the apes on thunderous horseback charged into the humans. They threw nets over them, beat them with sticks, and tied them up with lassos. It was great. Huge Gene, Brad, and I decided this time we would beat the apes at their own game. Big Russ and Mike C. each had their improvised ape weapons. Big Russ had an old fishing net he liked to use, and Mike C. had his old dog leash with a collar on it. He liked to come through and whip people with it. The 3 of us could hear Big Russ and Mike C. off to the right, so we went very quietly to the left. and then up a ways into the field. Huge Gene's plan was to create a diversion. Brad would lay in the cornfield directly between Gene and me. I would be across by about 5 rows or so. Brad was to call out for Gene or me by whisper yelling our names, just loud enough so they could hear him, but not so loud that it would be obvious to them that Brad was trying to get their attention. We would wait until they came screaming down the row. We'd wait until we were almost on top of Brad, and then Gene would charge them from his side and me from my side. Then we would see who the apes really were. We all very quietly crawled and moved into place. Gene gave the signal to Brad to start whisper yelling our names. The signal was Huge Gene's idea. He would put his hands to his mouth, make like a little megaphone, and yell out, "Caw-caw, caw-caw," like there was some kind of tropical bird in the cornfield, and then it would be commonplace to hear a loud caw-caw. Anyway, little Brad began to softly yelling, "Gene, Mike, where are you?" It didn't take long. We could see the corn rustling, and we could hear Mike C. give out his ape call. Arrgh. Big Russ was storming down from one end of the field and Mike from the other. They were both on the same row that little Brad was laying down in. I looked through the corn and down at Russ. He was pumping his feet while standing up on his bike and trying to twirl his old fishnet in the air so he could trap little Brad in it. I looked down at Mike C., trying his best to hold the whipping leash with his non-broken arm and trying to keep his bike straight with his arm with the cast on it while trying to pedal. I figured the best bet for me was to do the little Mutual of Omaha Wild Kingdom action. Meaning, if you remember, Marlon Perkins would always narrate something like this. Hunkered down in the grass, the lion surveys his prey. He spots a wounded wildebeest in the back of the pack. As mighty as the lion is, he knows it's easier to pounce on a wounded animal. That was exactly my strategy. I'll take out the wounded Mike C. and let Huge Gene go after Big Russ. After the ape sounds of Mike C. and Russ, the frantic pedaling, the knocking down of corn stalks, and the screams from little Brad, I managed to hear the signal to attack from Huge Gene. Caw-caw, caw-caw, caw-caw. If I wanted Mike C., I'd better beat Huge Gene to him. I jumped up and bolted through the corn rows, taking dead aim at Mike C. Huge Gene saw me and darted towards Big Russ. I dove headfirst into the side of Mike C., maybe a few feet before he could have run smack into Brad. I caught him in the side, right under his broken arm, and he and I went sailing into the corn row behind us. Big Russ, seeing the ambush and on the rushing Huge Gene, threw his net over both Gene and Brad. Big Russ was now approaching Gene and Brad at ramming speed on his bike. With the net snarled all around them, it was not looking good. They were about to take a direct hit from Big Russ on his bike. Huge Gene stood up and yelled at Brad to go back up in the corn row. He pushed Brad back and then moved back into the next row. Now, Big Russ was headed not at Gene and Brad, but right directly into his own net. He tried to stop, but to no avail. He flung himself into the net. Gene and Brad, still wrapped up in the net themselves, collapsed on top of Big Russ and his bike. An all-out war now ensued, man versus ape. We humans kept yelling things out like, "Get your hands off of me, you damn dirty ape," while the apes were yelling, "The only good human is a dead human." Bodies were slammed into the corn, punches thrown, Mike C. conking heads with his cast, bikes tossed, an all-out war with no actual winners. What stopped this war was a familiar bellow that echoed across the cornfield, down into the woods, into the mountains, and then back to us. "Gene and Brad, dinner now," was the call from Mr. Tidwell. We broke up and agreed to hook back up for some baseball after we all ate. The next day was Memorial Day. The neighborhood Memorial Day party started at around 1 or 2 o'clock, I guess. All the dads and we kids helped set up. The dads set up picnic tables and coolers and stuff in the middle of our street. They figured that was fair to everyone. We did the usual things, ate hot dogs, potato salad, which I never liked, watermelon, and so on. The real fun came after we all ate. We had tried to get the dads to play us in a game of stickball or baseball or kickball or something, but they were just not moving. I guess they were happy just sitting around drinking beer and talking. We, however, needed a little bit more action than that. I'm quite sure we were at the point of bugging the dads to all get out. I suppose that whining like babies until we got them to play something with us was not the best way to go about things. Finally, after about the 900th time we asked them to do something, Mr. Tidwell said, "What the hell are we, your entertainment committee? Go play, go down in the woods or something and give us a few minutes." "Okay," we said. Sounded good to us. We meandered down to where our old fort was before the dads tore it down due to rule violations earlier in the year. Huge Gene spotted a candle in the fort and some old matches wrapped in tinfoil. He took out the matches and lit the candle. Then he started playing around in some grass, seeing if it would burn. Big Russ chimed in that pine needles burn real quick and makes a good torch when you get a few branches together. That's when things got a little out of hand. Huge Gene and Russ started gathering pine branches and setting them on fire. Huge Gene was running around brushing the grass and the underbrush with the pine branch on fire. Little fires were starting on the brush and grass. Little Brad, Mike C., and I jumping around trying to stamp out the little fires. We would get one out, and then Huge Gene would have another one going. Big Russ could not believe it. He was pissed, yelling at Huge Gene to stop. But he was on a roll. Huge Gene was having a ball, running around starting his little fires. We were doing pretty good at putting them out. Then I saw Huge Gene run with the flaming pine branch. The wind, as he ran, blew the fire right up to the big end of the branch that he was holding. Huge Gene must have burned his fingers because he dropped the branch, waving his hand back and forth. We all laughed. It was about time that nature got even with him. The problem was the big burning branch flew into a big bush. This exploded into flames that were now a good 8 feet high. We all just stood there, mouths wide open, staring at the fire. There was no putting it out. Big Russ ran into the burning bush, took off his shirt, and started swatting at the flames. "Hurry up and help me, you a-holes," he yelled. We all took our shirts off and started swatting at the flames, trying to quell the burning bush. The bush flames leapt up into the smaller trees around the bush. Now they leapt up into the taller trees. Now we had a fire. "Run, run, run," yelled Huge Gene. Big Russ yelled out, "Follow me. We'll go back down over through the woods and come out from the sand pit. This way we won't be near the fire and it'll look like we had nothing to do with it." That sounded good enough to all of us. We ran like the wind through the woods, down the ravine, up the ravine, through the sand pit, and finally up to 4th Street. We made it, we thought. As we came walking up the end of 4th Street, we looked back over behind the cornfield, and there was an obvious fire, smoke billowing from the woods. In an instant, everyone was running down the street from the Memorial Day bash. And there we were, 5 innocent children who, even though they were in the woods just a few minutes ago, knew nothing of the fire. My poor dad. I will never forget the sounds he made or the look on his face when he saw us. All 5 of us were just standing there looking stupid, I'm sure, covered in black dust, no shirts, hair all messed up, smelling like smoke. While my dad was running down the street, he looked up at us and said, "You stupid Fs." Never in my life did I think I would hear that word from my dad. But there it was. It kind of hung in the air until the velocity and force of its sound hit my ears. Mr. Tidwell, Mr. C., Russ's dad, heck, all of the adults in the neighborhood and all the kids gathered around us in a large semicircle. I thought for just a few minutes they were going to lynch us. My mom just started crying, not wanting to believe that her son could be so stupid as to set the woods on fire. Little John just started laughing and shaking his head. As if all that wasn't bad enough, now the Gansevoort Volunteer Fire Department trucks came roaring down the street, sirens blaring. They ran right over Mr. C's side yard and kept going down his lawn, getting as close to the growing flames and smoke as they could. As they got out of their fire truck, my dad had to tell the whole town who was burning down the woods. His son. As if that wasn't bad enough, right behind the fire trucks was a sheriff's car. Again, sirens blaring. We were done. I would be in jail at 10 years old. I wondered if we would all be in the same cell, like a jail cell, or if we were headed right to prison. Maybe working on a chain gang or something. Looking over at my dad, jail kind of looked good. If I thought my dad had a death stare before this, it was nothing compared to the death stare I was getting now. Sheriff Andrew Taylor, I kid you not, his name was Andy Taylor. Yes, Sheriff Andy Taylor of Mayberry fame. Got out of the car, said hello to the dads. Jerry, John, Brian, guys, what's going on here? The dads looked right at us. Sheriff Andy was a pretty tall dude. He had on the standard sheriff hat, big sunglasses, and of course the big square jaw. He then proceeded right over to us. We were still standing in the open end of the semicircle of people. He bent down, looked right at Big Russ, then over to the fire in the woods, then back at huge Gene, and did the same to each one of us. Why don't we do this, he said. Why don't you boys just tell me what happened? No BS, and we can wrap this up. Sound good? Little Brad burst out in tears first, stammering with the story. He spilled his guts. Then he spilled our guts. It was so bad that I felt like my guts were outside of me, rolling around on the road, and all the neighbors were stomping on them. You boys got anything to add to that story? Any corrections to make or anything? Or is that the straight poop? Sheriff Andy asked. We all just shook our heads no. We were in disbelief that from a fun game of Planet of the Apes to being arrested, how quickly things change. Now Mayor Bill Campbell was coming down the street driving his tractor, standing up to catch a better look at his burning woods. That's right, all of the cornfields, the woods, the sand pit were all his land. He just allowed us to play on it. He made his way down the street slowly, but he finally got there and pulled the tractor to a stop. He swung his leg over the tractor and hopped down. Chewing on a piece of grass, he tipped his straw hat back and said, Sheriff, what's going on? The sheriff walked over to him, put his arm around him, and the two of them meandered behind the tractor. They were there for what felt like a million years. In the meantime, all of us were getting death stares from our respective fathers. Mr. C yelling at Mike C about where he got the candles and matches that he had told him not to take. Mike C crying back at him. Mr. Tidwell standing over huge Gene. He didn't look so huge with his dad yelling down his face, barking loudly at him. My dad was the worst. He just stood there looking at me in a state of disappointment. Sheriff Taylor and the mayor came back around walking ever so slowly. Each step of the sheriff's boot coming down on the pavement sounded like a dinosaur. Boom, boom. Like he was going to stomp on our heads and squish the brain guts out of our ears. But he stopped, looked at the dads and said, Gentlemen, Bill has decided not to press charges, which he could have because these kids have damaged his land. All the dads thanked Bill, the mayor, profusely and offered him a case of Genesee cream ale to take back with him. The fireman came walking out of the woods with the captain headed straight toward us. You boys could have been killed, you know. Fire is a dangerous beast. You need to respect fire, not play with it, he commanded us. With that, all the chaos seemed to be over. The fireman said goodbye and drove away, leaving some pretty big wheel marks on Mr. C's side lawn. Sheriff Andy shook hands with all the dads, leaned over at us and said, You boys behave now, you hear? I'm sure your dads will punish you better than Judge Snark. Then he drove away. We were still surrounded by the neighborhood at the open end of the semicircle. My dad just pointed to the house and yelled, Go inside, take a bath, go to your room, and I will deal with you later. Which I did. The others pretty much got the same treatment. As it started to get dark, I crawled up in my bed and looked out the window, kind of hiding behind the screen in the window so I could not be seen. All the moms and dads were still outside, sitting around and laughing. The little kids were still running around. I was kind of hoping that this Memorial Day party would go on forever. The longer it went, the longer I would not be punished. Suffice it to say, that party went on long enough for me to fall asleep. Amazingly, I was not yelled at the next morning. I was simply told that all of us boys would be painting the church next weekend. And that was chapter 25 of the book, Tales from My Bicentennial Year, by Mike Buell. And next time, let me see what we got for next time, chapter 26, The Big Hole. Thank you. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all of the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers, and reminding you to listen to the John and Ken Show on KFI AM 640, Monday through Friday from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. Pacific Time. Also, KFI needs to bring back Brian Suits and his show, The Dark Secret Place. Hashtag bring back Brian Suits. Until next time, be honest, be smart, be beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.